Special Projects at the ISS. This event is being co-hosted with News24. As the final participants connect their audios, please be reminded to keep your camera turned off and your microphone muted until we reach the Q&A portion for today's event. The Q&A will be conducted via the raise hand function and the chat function in Zoom. Any questions posted on social media will be fed to your chair. Welcome to Is a Social Compact Key to Saving South Africa's Economy? Otilia, you have the floor.
Hello and welcome everyone. On the 25th of February 2021, Statistics South Africa released the quarterly labour force survey for October to December 2020. In it was revealed that 32.5% of South Africa's population is currently unemployed. The picture, as you'll hear this afternoon, is a little bit grimmer. The question that we wish to respond to is whether a social compact can be able to help us address some of South Africa's economic woes. You will hear from Dr. Yaki Cilia, the chair of the Board of Trustees for the Institute for Security Studies, as well as the head of the African Futures and Innovation team at the ISS. You will also hear from Mweletsi Mbeki, the deputy chair of the South African Institute for International Affairs. After that, you will hear from Kolelwa Kashe-Katia, the Director of Project Management at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, MISTRA. In the conversation that they will lead this afternoon, we seek to respond to one of the key questions bedeviling South Africa. There are very few conversations on South Africa where the question of poverty, inequality, unemployment, crime, and violence are not raised. These are key questions that we do have to respond to now in 2021, but questions that we perhaps will be responding to in future. Before going into the discussion this afternoon, the Institute for Security Studies, in partnership with the Hans Seidel Foundation, is proud to share this short video speaking to the question of, is it you that can be sent? The question around the prospects for Tuma Nina in South Africa. Yaki?
The COVID-19 crisis has exposed South Africa's weak economic fundamentals. South Africa was already growing more slowly than its peers when the pandemic hit. Without deep structural reform, its average long-term growth rate is a miserly 1.9%. This is significantly below any rate that would alleviate poverty, reduce inequality, and grow employment. Two recent reports from the Institute for Security Studies use the International Futures Forecasting System to model and present an alternative aspirational vision for South Africa called Tuma Nina, or Send Me. The Tuma Nina scenario unlocks long-term growth by modeling the impact of transitions in health and education, resolving the electricity crisis to enable modern industrialization, and implementing rural land reform to transform livelihoods in the former homelands where poverty is endemic. More than half of South Africa's total population live in extreme.
Hi, sorry, Otilia, I missed that. Just say that again.
We are able to hear the audio, but we cannot see the video itself.
Okay, sorry, apologies for that. Let me see what I can do.
The COVID-19 crisis has exposed South Africa's weak economic fundamentals. South Africa was already growing more slowly than its peers when the pandemic hit. Without deep structural reform, its average long-term growth rate is a miserly 1.9%. This is significantly below any rate that would alleviate poverty, reduce inequality, and grow employment. Two recent reports from the Institute for Security Studies use the International Futures Forecasting System to model and present an alternative aspirational vision for South Africa called Tuma Nina, or Send Me. The Tuma Nina scenario unlocks long-term growth by modeling the impact of transitions in health and education, resolving the electricity crisis to enable modern industrialization, and implementing rural land reform to transform livelihoods in the former homelands where poverty is endemic. More than half of South Africa's total population live in extreme poverty, surviving on an average income of less than $5.50 per person per day. Social grants alleviate the symptoms of suffering, but the only structural solution to the dilemma is job growth in the formal sector. That, in turn, requires sustained rapid economic growth over successive decades, and for that growth to be inclusive. President Cyril Ramaphosa has committed to use the coronavirus crisis as an opportunity to build a pro-growth social compact. This, combined with the implementation of evidence-based economic policies, could boost South Africa's economy to be almost 50% larger within 2 decades compared to the current growth forecast. Beyond determined leadership and significant government reform, the Tuma Nina pathway requires better management and efficiency in the public health sector, whilst lowering costs in the private sector. In education, South Africa must improve graduation rates, focus on quality, and invest in the skills for the fourth industrial revolution. In energy, the country must pursue a least-cost energy solution predicated on renewables and shift away from fossil fuels. In manufacturing, South Africa must invest more in research and development, accelerate the expansion of information and communications technology infrastructure, and promote value-added goods for export to the African market. In agriculture, the country must support land and smallholder agricultural reform in the former homelands by providing tenure security. In addition, it must support commercial agriculture, reduce food waste, and improve water management. None of this is possible without a forward-looking pro-growth social compact combined with the implementation of evidence-based economic policies. Read the full report on the ISS website at www.issafrica.org.
Yaki, having conducted much of the research into what is required in rebuilding South Africa's economy, but in particular making the case in some ways towards the social compact, if you can introduce us to this theme in a bit more detail around what it really means and to what extent can a social compact be the way towards renewing South Africa's efforts towards growing the economy?
Thanks, Otelia, and apologies for that glitch with the showing of a video in the beginning. So I'm going to share screen to show a few slides because I have a specific argument that I want to make. And I start off by quoting from a National Treasury report at the end of, this is not a good day. That says that South Africa's current economic trajectory is unsustainable. Economic growth has stagnated, unemployment is rising, and inequality remains high. The government should urgently implement a series of economic reforms that can boost South Africa's growth in the short term, while also creating the conditions for a higher long-term sustainable growth. So there is urgency on the short term, and then the requirement to place us on a long-term sustainable growth trajectory. Now, this graph on the left-hand side shows is in constant US dollars. Time is at the bottom. The green line at the bottom green line is South Africa's GDP per capita till 2020 and a forecast until 2030. And the top line, the blue line, is the average for other upper middle income countries to which we often compare ourselves. So what has happened is that the gap between South Africa and other upper middle income countries has increased from about 87% to about 76% at the moment, and we expect, our forecasts are that it will reduce to about 72% by 2030. And this is despite the fact that we expect South Africa on a long-term growth trajectory to grow at about 2.1%. But of course, other upper middle income countries, even taking China out of the equation, is going to grow at 3%. So we are falling further and further behind average rates of comparable countries. The video showed that we've done a number of work. We've actually done a significant amount of work on the long-term future of South Africa. But I refer to these two policy papers and briefs in particular, where, as the video showed, we modeled interventions in health, education, electricity, modern manufacturing, investment in economic freedom, land, agriculture, and water, particularly in the former homelands. If those interventions are successfully implemented, we think that South Africa could get to an average growth trajectory of about 3% per annum. That would mean that the growing gap between South Africa and the averages of our peers will cease. South Africa will not really be catching up, although over the longer term that does happen, but the widening gap will cease, and that we could recover to our peak 2014 GDP per capita at around 2024. Now, many of you would know this quote from Ratan Tata, the former chairperson of the Tata Group, where he made the remark that if you want to walk fast, walk alone. But if you want to walk far, walk together. And I think none of us on this call query the requirement for a social compact, but we need to walk fast and we need to walk urgently. Eventually, we also need to walk together. But instead, what is happening is that South Africa is increasingly a country apparently at war with itself. We are actively dissuading local and international skills and investment instead of attracting them. And we seem to want to perpetuate the divisions of the past, a past that is based on race and racism, in our current policies, instead of adopting an inclusive approach, which can only be based on class and non-racialism. And there are many in South Africa that believe that redistribution, particularly on the populist side, is a feasible development strategy in the 21st century. It isn't. What is happening is that taxpayers and the rich are leaving South Africa and they're taking their knowledge with them. So my argument, in actual fact, is that in the short term now, what should happen is that South Africa should really pull out all the stops to prioritize economic growth. This is a graph that shows the relationship between GDP growth and employment growth. And without going into the graph, I think it's clear the only way to reduce unemployment in South Africa is to grow the economy, in particular to grow the formal economy. The formal economy is the engine on the train that pulls the entire rest of the economy down. Only growth in formal sector employment will, over long time horizons, reduce inequality, unemployment, and poverty. So yes, we need to start about framing our debate. And there are many ways of framing our debate. The Germans would refer to the social market economy. China would refer to the socialist market economy, or now socialism with Chinese characteristics, the Nordics to the social democratic system, and the Americans, let's call them a mixed free market economy. And in South Africa, we've had, the rainbow nation and the development state and radical economic transformation is probably the three phrases that have been used the most. But I think that probably what South Africa aspires to is a social democratic framing, where there is a significant component of a welfare state that is already the situation in South Africa, particularly around social grants. There is a key role for the state as regulator and referee that partners with the private sector for growth. But an opportunity economy where social institutions such as labor unions and government policy constrain the growth of inequality, but where the state and the private sector invest in building human capital and providing opportunity. There is a big difference between investment in human capital and doing what we are currently doing, which is handing out social grants in the place of service delivery because of the failure of service delivery. Now, unlocking growth in South Africa means following evidence and science. That's what we did with COVID. But we only seem to want to do that in COVID and in no other area of South Africa's governance or economy. It means consequence management. And one can't stress that enough. South Africa seems to be, particularly if you're a member of the governing party, no consequences seem to apply to government officials, but particularly to politicians. It means stuff like removing constraints on electricity generation, not trying to force coal and nuclear into it, eventually releasing additional spectrum, which the courts have recently now again postponed, removing the red tape and regulatory burden. Now the Vulindlela initiative is busy working on this. It means working to end skilled outward migration and capital flight, and actually working to attract skilled inward migration, to provide certainty on expropriation of land and property, largely because this has been a huge factor in foreign direct investment in South Africa. It means professionalizing the civil service, ending cadre deployment, and simplifying Black economic empowerment. And the letter of the president last week is really a big, indication of positive change in this regard. And a government that actively partners with business. We have largely what I think most of us consider to be an incapable government. We need to build a capable government. So I think my argument simply, Ottilia, is that eventually we must embark upon our own process of myth-making. We'll have to recreate our history and create the opportunity to walk far. But for now, we really need to lead, implement, and grow. So thank you very much for allowing me a few minutes. And again, apologies for all the technical glitches.
Thank you, Yaki. It wouldn't be an event during the pandemic where Zoom doesn't at some point let us down. I'm going to turn now to you, Mweletsi, just in terms of your reflections on this question around whether or not, one, we need a social compact and for what purpose. Yaki has already said some interesting things around South Africa being a country at war with itself, one that needs a social compact at which economic growth is at the center. And perhaps importantly, this suggestion that not only do we need to walk far or make our way ahead, but we need to do this in partnership. So I'm turning to you for your reflections on some of what Yaki has said, but also most useful really is to hear your take and your perspective on this question of how a social compact, if at all, can help South Africa grow. Mweletsi, in order for us to hear you, I ask that you please unmute yourself right at the bottom left corner of the Zoom window.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Ottilia, and good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to discuss this issue of the social compact. I know in South Africa, the social compact is a very popular concept, which we all would like to see happen. But unfortunately, before you reach a social compact, or I suppose for many people, the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, and others are our role model of a social compact. Before you have to reach that, there are many steps that you have to travel, many of which are unfortunately very painful and do not involve social, they involve a lot of conflict. The one country that I always tell people South Africa is most similar to is the United States. We have a lot in common with the United States. We were both British colonies. We both imported European settlers in the 17th centuries. We both imported African slaves also in the 17th century. We had slavery, in our case, abolished in 1838 in America, in 1863, if I remember Lincoln's abolition of slavery, the date correctly. we had an indigenous population. A significant part of which was absolutely destroyed in America, the Native Americans in South Africa, the San people. So we have a lot in common, but if you ask yourself, how did America actually develop from being a British colony exporting raw materials to England? The only thing that had to happen, it had to destroy the economy that Britain had left behind, which was the slave-based economy of cheap labor and export of raw materials. So that is how the United States developed. So the United States industrialization could only happen. Can you remove the slide, please? I don't need it at the moment. The United States development could only happen after a mega conflict to destroy the economic system that the United States had inherited from British colonialism. Now, we also inherited an economic system from British colonialism. And this is what many people either forget or prefer not to address. Our mining industry, which is the backbone of the South African economy because it is the backbone of our exports, was developed by the British. And it was developed and structured with the labor supply in a very particular way, which still obtains today. Now, the challenge is, can we continue with this British style economy just through social compacts? I am skeptical of that. Can we overcome the migrant labor system? Can we overcome the Bantustan system and have a proper urbanization in South Africa just through social compact? I don't think so. I think there is a lot of very, very, very painful steps that need to be taken in South Africa before we can start talking of social compact. The Americans could talk of social compact maybe in the 1930s with the New Deal, but it took them from 1863 to the 1930s before they could start talking about a social compact with the New Deal. But actually, the social compact in the United States only started in the mid 1950s with the famous Brown versus the Board of Education, and then the Voting Rights Act, but mostly in the 1960s. So when you talk of a social compact in a society like ours, we're not like Sweden. We were a colony. We are part of what is called the New World. So we are a hugely conflict-ridden society until we reach a certain stage. Yaki, if you could just show that illustration. Can I have my illustration now? Oh, I can't see you. Yeah, no, not that one. Let's go to the one before. No, the one before. Yes, this one. Now, this is to show you why South Africa is still a hugely conflict-ridden society. And these conflicts are not easily resolved with social compacts. If you look at the two elite, and that's where conflict matters, people always think that conflict is problematic between the rich and the poor, or between the elite and the masses. Actually, the most significant conflict conflict is within the elite. In South Africa, the most important conflict is between the business elite and the political elite. And why are these two elites in a huge conflict? They are in a huge conflict because the business elite lost political power in 1994. And when they lost political power, for the sake of time, I will move further. I will go to show you the vulnerability. The vulnerability which results from their loss of political power of the business elite is that they can have their assets seized tomorrow by the political elite. They get levels of taxes which are way unaffordable, imposed by the political elite. They are exposed to levels of corruption by the political elite and the general mismanagement of the economy, healthcare, all the things, the good things that Yaki said we have to address. Just to give you an illustration about the mismanagement, in America, the United States vaccinates 2 million people a day. It took South Africa 2 weeks to vaccinate 100,000 people. Now, the consequence on our financial services sector of this level of inefficiency by the political elite is enormous, because now the insurance companies are having to pay huge amounts of payments due to the illness of the population in South Africa, when we should by now have vaccinated. If we are going at the American rate of 2 million a day, we would have vaccinated a big part of the South African population. So that vulnerability of the business elite accounts for what Yaki described as the country at war with itself. There is a war between the business elite and the political elite, who are trying to possess the assets and the wealth of the business elite. And the consequence of that is what Yaki has pointed out: the flight of capital, the taxpayers leaving the country, the rich leaving the country, and so on. Now, can we solve this conflict between the business elite and the political elite with a compact? My feeling is no. And for the sake of time, Madam Chair, I think I should stop there. Maybe I can elaborate during the discussion. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mweletsi. Kalelwa, you've heard both what Mweletsi and Yaki have said. Right now, Mweletsi has said, can we solve the conflict between the business elite and the political elite? And his answer was a one-word no. Earlier, having said a social compact on its own is not enough. Now, with Yaki having made the case, so to speak, of a form of a social compact that prioritizes economic growth, economic development, but also that recognizes what he referred to as a country that remains at war with itself, something that Mweletsi picked up on as well. With your work through MISTRA, and I know that MISTRA has conducted some surveys and spoken to people around the importance, perhaps, of a social compact, if you can share with us your reflections on the basis of that great work that MISTRA has done, but also if you have your own personal reflections, Kolelwa, we welcome those. Please do go ahead.
Thank you so much, Attilia, for that. And thank you for the opportunity to the colleagues at ISS, Yaki, Attilia, and other colleagues. And thank you to Mr. Mbeki for that amazing response. What I will do is to actually, as you've stated, first of all, I'll start with my own opinion, which is actually disagree, gentlemen, who said we a social compact is not likely in South Africa. I'd like to argue that it is likely. It's just that it does require strong leadership. It does require an honest dialogue about all these elephants in the room that we seem to have. My point of departure in terms of Yaki's presentation is this, wherein he amplifies economic growth as being the most important factor that we need to be focusing on at the moment, while being mindful of the fact that we are a country at war, and therefore there's no utility in focusing on those things. Rather, let's look at economic growth. And I differ. My position is that we need to start with the difficult work of dealing with these things that make us a country at war. And I'd like to argue that this type of war, a different type of war that we are still at, is informed by our history and the fact that we cannot agree on our history. We see our history in different ways, and it's all on the basis of the color of our skin or class, gender, and so on. There's all those issues that intersect. And as a result, you find that if you are a woman and you are young and Black and from a rural area, you are facing the biggest challenge. You are the worst of the lot in this country. So when you talk about economic growth, that kind of economic growth, as long as it's not inclusive or mindful of that intersectionality, that which is mindful of a young Black woman who is in a rural South Africa. So if it's going to be economic growth, then that's something else. But for compacting to be meaningful, there has to be dialogue. And I agree with Moletsi that that work has to happen before, but that requires strong leadership at the top. And I also agree that there's no utility in looking only at the Nordic countries like Sweden, because those are more homogenous. And what sets us apart, and that leads to this resentment and resistance to the idea of reconciliation, is informed by the fact that we are so diverse and there's conflicting interests. But it does require political will and strong leadership to galvanize society around a common vision. Because for a compact to happen, you need a common vision, and actually you need a particular climate. And that climate is usually a crisis. And we do have that crisis, and the crisis is that we are a country at war. We have another global crisis, which is COVID-19. So all these things, provide a proper recipe for, or an opportunity rather, for social compacting. We are in a climate where there's economic decline, there's state capture, there's a hollowing out of state where there's no capacity to even deliver the most basic needs. So when you look at other countries that have gone into compacting, it is usually in response to a crisis. And I'd like to argue that we do have that crisis. We have trust deficit where business does not trust government, government does not trust business, the citizens do not trust the state, and so on. Different racial groups do not trust one another in communities, neighbors do not trust. So then that is a fertile environment for a compacting process, but it requires that honest dialogue. We really need to have an honest conversation about race in this country. And if it doesn't happen, we'll continue having these ruptures, like the fees must fall, roads must fall. Before that, we've seen the total shutdown led by these young women who are Black and impoverished. And we've seen how they could actually even storm the union buildings. So there is actually agency there. But what it requires is that there has to be agreement between the state and the citizens around a common goal. So what we need to do during that dialogue is to establish what that common vision or common goal is for the country, like other countries have done before. I'll use the example of, the Asian tigers that we like using when we talk about the developmental state. I mean, there was a kind of, non-cohesive, kind of pushing of government to become more involved. This is what we call at Mistra an activist type of business, where business is also compelled to come to the party by that leader. If you look at Rwanda is very similar to us in terms of the conflict that they went through. When we were going through our transition in 1994, they were coming out, there was a genocide. And to come out of that phase, there had to be a process of compacting, which was mainly informed by, there was an element of justice to it. And I think that's what's missing with us. We've tried compacting before through the TRC process. CODESA was a compacting moment. However, the justice element, which I believe is causing this resentment, wherein you find especially young people feel that there are others in our society who have this unearned privilege. And as long as that unearned privilege persists, we are not going to find each other. So how do we then do that? That strong leader who can compel business to actually come to the party. We've seen elements of that with Business for South Africa during COVID, now with the rollout of vaccines. It's an example of that. We're seeing a lot of activity around the NEDLEC, which was dormant for a moment. And NEDLEC is actually the platform, the official platform for compacting in South Africa by law. The NEDLEC Act actually made it possible for that platform to actually facilitate these dialogues and to get social partners to argue and find each other, but they're always at deadlock. Now, something is happening at NEDLEC, but is it sustainable? Can they move beyond COVID? So that's why I'm saying this is actually the opportune time during to actually study society and actually get even those few business leaders or captains of industry involved in the Business for SA initiatives to actually commit. But also we need institutions that will compel society and social partners, but also there has to be sanctioning mechanisms wherein we don't just come and agree to certain things without follow through. So I'd like to state that we can still revisit that CODESA moment. There's been others who've called for a second CODESA. But what we can take from CODESA is that we don't really need to be focused on 100% consensus, which is what always leaves us at a deadlock. Sufficient consensus can take us forward. We can't make sure that every single province and every single race, and because we know that we're so diverse as a country. So sufficient consensus, strong leadership, and honest dialogue. And the lowest hanging fruit for me is just this issue of the 350 rands, which every month they keep extending. But if that were to be made more long-term to ensure that at least there's some basic form of income, that not a single South African can live below a particular poverty line or whatever line that we draw on the sand, but we all have to agree on this. And I think we can find opportunities for even other bigger issues that trouble us, but we can start now during COVID. I think I'll leave it there, Attilia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Xolelwa. I think some key points around leadership, that economic growth cannot just be economic growth within the South African context. It has to be inclusive. And contrasting in many ways what has been said already around social compact, saying, if there ever was a time for South Africa to look at the possibility of a social compact, now is the time in the midst of another form of crisis. But in order for that to go ahead, we need honest dialogue. So two things, we need honesty and we need dialogue. And then ideally, there's a need for an agreement on the results thereof. But in the absence of an agreement, there should be sufficient consensus. Now, before we go into the Q&A and discussion segment, I will put some questions still and solicit some comments from the other panelists. But first, would like to involve you, our audience, in this process as well. Now, there will be a poll that will pop up on your screen if you're connected with us via Zoom. This poll poses two questions to you. So it's not a long poll, very quick poll around the questions on your perspectives on the social compact. So it's not enough for Yaki, Mweletsi, Xolelwa, and myself to say something about it. We would want to hear from you as well. Once the poll pops up on your screen, please do quickly respond. As soon as you respond, the poll will disappear. The results of the poll will be shared within this conversation. So this will not be kept secret. It'll be part of Xolelwa, an inclusive process of hearing the views of the people that are tuned in with us today. Now, Yaki, already you have your hand raised. Kolelwa has said a few things that in some ways conflict, in some ways complement and supplement what you've said. So I'm going to turn to you first, Yaki, in terms of your initial reactions. And then Weletsi, after Yaki has spoken, mindful that you said at this point, at least for the business elite and the political elite, the options for a social compact are, as far as you're concerned, not there. But let me challenge you, and I know that you are going to speak to this as well. Beyond the elite, what are the prospects there? So first to you, Yaki, you had your hand raised, so please go ahead.
Thanks, Ottilia. Nobody can argue with the requirement for inclusive growth and social compacting, and it's like motherhood and apple pie. We all know at some point this has to happen, and I'm not disputing that at all. I am saying that if you do not get the engine of the economy running and slowly and surely increasing speed, then you cannot, in actual fact, deal with the escalating problems. And that I do long-term forecasting. We have done studies on Tunisia, Algeria, Ethiopia, countries that face unique problems and challenges. And in all of these countries, you see that economic growth is an insufficient but necessary prerequisite. So all my argument is, in terms of prioritization, the first priority is to decide on a few key goals, targets, priorities, and to focus on that. And then over time, of course, we have to get to our social compact and so on. But, I during my presentation, I put up the kind of debate I think that we should be starting to happen, social democracy or whatever the case may be. And yes, we need to have those discussions and those debates. But I think that South Africa is not like the Asian tigers, nor are we like the US, I should say. I disagree with Moletsi there. The Asian tigers and Rwanda followed an authoritarian developmental model that was brutal, and particularly in the case of Rwanda, in terms of its developmental model. That is not an option that is open for South Africa. We both have to develop and democratize at the same time. And only substantive democracy will, in actual fact, take South Africa forward. But so that's one part of the argument. The other point is that agreeing on key goals and targets it's not the same as a social compact. Already there is a process at sectoral level to come to agreements and to set clear targets, and South Africa is moving ahead. But we need to prioritize, and the only argument I'm making is that in the short to medium term, we really need to focus on those essentials that will unlock economic growth. And yes, then we need to have the discussions about our past and our future, but we will also have to undertake a process of our own myth-making. We will have to, in a sense, recreate a story of our past that may not be entirely accurate in my view, but we will have to reach back far into our history to build a vision of this compact. And that, my personal view is, it's not possible with a current generation of people like myself, that in actual fact, it will be the future generation, Kolelwa and her compatriots, that will eventually take this forward. We need to focus on lifting the boat. And the only thing, the tide that lifts at the moment that we need is economic growth. Without economic growth, inequality, poverty, etc., will simply increase. And we will eventually find ourselves in the situation where violence will become the only option for South Africans.
Thank you, Yaki. Well, let's say I'm going to turn to you. So my question was, beyond the business elite and the political elite, looking at the other classes and levels within South Africa, is a social compact a feasible idea? And minding now what Yaki has said, that beyond setting some key targets, that's insufficient as a framing for a social compact. What are your views on that particular point?
Okay, well, the social compact, if I understand correctly, really is between people who hold power. It's not between people who have no power. Because if I have power and you have no power, I don't need a social compact. I can enforce my position of power. So I don't need your acquiescence. It's only when you also have power that we then have to go to the sufficient consensus that Kolelo refers to. So when I look at the society of South Africa, in the society of South Africa, power lies between only these two sections of our society have real power, and that's the political elite and the business elite. The rest of us don't have the political power. We follow instructions. We do what we are told. So when that's how I understand the compacts that Yaki was talking about. Now you can have all sorts of alliances. The ANC had alliances with trade unions, for example, to fight against apartheid. But no sooner was apartheid gone than, as we can see today, the ANC threw the organized labor overboard by just canceling unilaterally agreements it had entered into. So it was not a social compact because it was not an agreement between equals. CODESA was an agreement more or less between equals because at the end of the day, both the mass movement and its friends like the ANC and the National Party and its friends like big business could destroy each other. So it was a moment in South Africa of what you can say mutual assured destruction. So they could get into a social compact because they both had power and they could destroy each other. As of now, that's why if you look at South Africa today, many people think that South Africa has a crisis. South Africa is in a pre-crisis situation. South Africa is not in a crisis. There are certain problems that it has, but it is not in a crisis situation.
Thank you very much. I see Kolelwa nodding there, and I'm sure you want to come in at this point. Those of you that have the poll still up on your screens, if I can ask you to respond to the two questions. 78% of you have already noted your responses. It is a completely anonymous poll. And like I said, your vote remains your secret, except for the part where you look at the results. Now, a key point there is to say, rarely do you have 78% participation, but we're gunning for 100% here. Kolelwa, before we go into the Q&A, again, a few points have been made. Moletsi says a social compact has to be a compact between equals, the business elite. In your remarks, you spoke specifically about the inclusion of everyone, but perhaps you cited more poignantly the inclusion of that young, rural African woman, perhaps also uneducated, that shouldn't be forgotten simply because they do not have political or financial power. If you could underline that point for us before we go into the Q&A. Monte McMurchie, Hans-Werner Bussmann, I see your hands and I will come to you in a moment. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Ottilia, and thank you to my fellow panelists for actually challenging my position. And yes, Yaki, I do agree in terms of the human rights issue, because we are a human rights-based country. So it's difficult to actually draw parallels with these countries that are led by these, well, they have a kind of benign dictatorship in them, but it's still something that, needs to be parked there, especially when you speak about, I like it when you speak about socialism with Chinese characteristics. And I'm wondering if we can find a system that we can draw from and then say and put that disclaimer that with South African characteristics. So it could be that strong man or woman at the helm, but because it does require strong leadership. It's just that in these examples that have been used, there's a bit of dictatorship, and our country is constrained by our constitution, which, you know, puts human rights above everything else. On the young people and the issue of power, yes, compacting is usually a space that's occupied by the elite. But now, if you were to put the South African characteristics to the idea of compacting, where it becomes more inclusive, because I do believe that our youth have agency, and they are very powerful as well. We must make no mistake. These people are, I'm not part of that cohort. Thank you, Yaki, for that compliment. But they do have agency. And as we've seen in North Africa, they can bring down entire regimes. So we must not, you know, think of that grouping as a grouping that's not powerful just because they're not operating within the systems and structures that we've accepted as the corridors of power. A cell phone like this one can actually be a symbol of power for a young Black woman in a village in Mkanduli. They can take down an entire regime just using the cell phone, connect with their friends, and tomorrow they're in the corridors of the Union building. So we must not write. So when I'm thinking about this compact, it's that compact with our own characteristics that is mindful of our history, because we do have these psychological scars that came with long history of colonialism, much longer than many African countries. And then we had apartheid, and it left scars on each and every category, whether you're Black, white, or otherwise. And we are passing on those scars to our children. Hence, the fees must fall and all the hashtag movements, because that wound is there and it's still not attended to. So I still want to argue that we can even forge a compact around just healing of that historical scar. And it's a painful process, but that can entail compacting. How do we compel business to address this? Maybe it could be through the fees must fall movement, and in turn it impacts on education and so on. And we've seen the leadership of that movement. It's been mostly women, queer, Black, young. So there's an opportunity right there, and I don't think we should miss it. It should be something that we should harness, or otherwise, I mean, an implosion is actually something that is going to be unavoidable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the message there is don't write anyone out, regardless of how much power there is perceived. On your screen now, you will see the results of the poll that we just ran. Now, 58% of those of you that voted, which was just over 80% of the participants this afternoon, say that the South African Constitution should serve as the basis to craft a national social compact, followed after the National Development Plan, and lastly, at only 10%, is the Freedom Charter. Now, what is more important now, Yaki, you're going to be a little bit surprised, I think, by these results, which is one, that ending corruption, which is something that some of us in our earlier remarks alluded to, but we didn't center as part of our conversation on economic recovery. 50% says that is the most important thing at the moment. 35% says what's most important is growth. And only 15% say redistribution. So Yaki, I see you cheering there. But 15% is still 15%. We're now going to involve the rest of you in this conversation. Monte, you've had your hand raised for quite some time. So please do go ahead and pose your question. You will have to unmute yourself as well as keep your video on while you pose this question. Monte, please go ahead.
Monty McMurchie, I'm calling from Toronto. First of all, my commendation and compliments to everyone, inclusive in the moderator. But my comment question is this. For me, the word compact, I find very compelling versus contract. There is a qualitative difference between these two terms, notwithstanding that they both ascribe towards the similar norms. But a compact entails aspiration versus strict rules and words. And that to me is what is absolutely fundamental. And Yaki Silliers is correct in terms of health and education. How can you have an engaged social human capital if they are not healthy, capable of being employed, and also having the skill sets, whether intellectual or whether the transactional, highly essential trades? And again, allow me to conclude. The idea that it needs to be, in terms of governance, hope, aspiration, but in terms of compact. We are all in this together. No one is better than anyone else, but it's the figurehead that actually sets the thrall, how he or she deports him or herself. Everything else will then fall or rise from that. I thank all of you.
Thank you very much. And Kolelwa, already Dennis Jane has said your point around consensus is something that they agree with. Dennis, Jane, thank you so much for that comment and input. I'm going to turn now to Hans Werner Bussmann. You've had your hand raised for quite some time as well. Please go ahead, and then after you, Ruben do Nascimento, please pose your question, and then I'll go back to the panel to respond. Hans Werner, you will have to switch on your microphone yourself as well as your video.
My video is not starting, I'm afraid. But
that's okay. Please go ahead. We can hear you.
Nevertheless, thank you and greetings from Berlin to everybody. I can share most of the arguments raised by the panelists, and I'm pleased to see that the majority of those who have voted agree that the problem of corruption is a big elephant in the room. And I think whatever argument you raise in favor of increasing growth and in strengthening social values, how can that achieve anything if South Africa is not able in getting rid of the problem of corruption? From a German point of view, if you want to attract more investment, especially foreign direct investment, if this problem is not solved, you won't get anywhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ruben do Nascimento, please go ahead and pose your question or make your comment.
Hi, good afternoon. Unfortunately, I can't start my video. I think it's been disabled, but it's all good. My name is Ruben. I come from Pretoria. Can I just say it's a privilege to be able to be part of a conversation like this. I think it's very important for the dynamic that people are heard and that people have different views. And I'm particularly inspired by Kolelwa and just her voice in how young people are represented within this market, especially the 18 to 25-year-olds amongst all Africans, that there needs to be a representation because, yes, they are extremely bright and the future looks bright for them, but there needs to be leadership. And unfortunately, our government and even in all spheres of life, that leadership has let the people of South Africa and Africa down. And there's a call for exceptional moral leadership to rise up amongst the ranks. And I don't think it takes rocket science to be able to get to that. I think maybe just some encouragement. I think hope is what people need, especially young people, to speak into the lives of their plight. What is it? How are their home circumstances? Where are their fathers? Where are their mothers? And how can they get out of the situation to build a greater future and a brighter future for them and their children? I guess my question is just maybe amongst all of you guys, and Yaki, I just want to say I've read your book. Thank you so much for that insight. I just want to ask on how can we as young people carry on to be exceptional leaders within our communities and within our families? Where do we start? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question and comment. Panelists, you've heard the questions. The one and the comment from Monte relates to really the importance of language. Why a compact, aspirational as it may be preferred over referring to it even as a contract or even as an agreement. And then from Hans Werner, we've heard the question around corruption. It's come up within the spirit of our poll, but also repeated. What can be done really to address this, which may appear to be a key stumbling block towards economic growth, but sustainable and inclusive growth as well. And then finally, from Robert, we heard about leadership, but importantly, the question around what role for young people is there in this process. So I'm going to do this in reverse order. So Xolelwa, first over to you in terms of responding to some of these key comments and questions. Colleagues, I have noted the additional hands, and also please, for those of you who wish to still pose your questions, you may do so by clicking on reactions at the bottom of your screen. You will see there a raise hand option. Once you raise your hand, I will be able to note you and direct your question or comment to the panel. Over to you.
Thanks for the privilege again, Atilia, and thanks for the comments from the participants. And I agree with Monte about the language issue, because at times you find that the compact and contracts, sometimes even covenants, are used interchangeably, because there's this idea that they're all agreements, but we need to actually differentiate. I mean, like others would say, contracts, social contracts have to do with like agreeing to pay your tax and so on, whereas compacts have to do with, you know, more long-term, and it's associated with planning as well and vision. But how, I would like to put it to everyone here, how does a wounded nation plan? If you were to think of a child that's been molested for years and years and years and has lived through abuse, and abuse that has left a psychological scar, is this person able to plan and envision or have hope that I think Ruba referred to? If you are so wounded and you are so hopeless, and this is like the collective, you know, as South Africans, all of us, if imagine that collective witness and how we just cannot even think forward, maybe then like it would take me back to my points of entry where I said maybe then it is possible to have this compact. But I still want to put a disclaimer there that that difficult work of healing and cleansing that wound, as difficult and painful as it might be, but it is required. And I welcome the comment on the sufficient consensus, because it's very important. I mean, South Africa is so diverse, and our government spends so much time trying to get agreement from this one. We go to the rural woman, the urban ones, and then this province, and then this one, and then, you know, all the categories, we have to tick the boxes. And by the time they've finished consulting, a new administration emerges without ever doing anything about it. So it has to be sufficient, and we have to be agile. But with a scar, even that scar is even within our leadership, our political leaders, our business leaders are also wounded, and that's why they act in the way that they act right now. Young people are the future, and I think if they were to be included, maybe we could start getting, you know, better ideas, because right now, I mean, it's like an echo chamber, even on this platform, wherein we're not hearing enough from their views and how they see these things. And I think there's a lot of innovation there. There's a lot of missed opportunities, but most importantly, this is the majority of our society. And if you look at that category, 60% unemployment, they can easily take us down tomorrow. So I think the sooner we come to realize that, or another option could be a compact around these youthful issues or challenges. So if it's not COVID, it could be around, but it has to be specific to a particular issue, or it could be the project of revisiting the TRC, like maybe learning from Rwanda. Not saying we're going to be hostile to our citizens, but how do we then continue the work of the TRC? Many recommendations were made there, and nothing was followed through. And now we wonder why young people are so resentful. So I think we really need to pay attention to that resentment and the resistance to this project of reconciliation, because it will take us back to even before 1994. Thank you.
So basically, how do we move forward if we're still being held back by promises not yet met from the past? Mweletsi, I'm going to turn to you. These questions around specific on corruption, you highlighted it within the spirit of your presentation. So if you can maybe respond to that particular question, Mweletsi, that would be very useful.
Okay, Tilia, but I'm not very clear what the question was about corruption. I must say I'm very pleased that the survey showed corruption, because what it shows, what corruption is a symptom. It's not the act itself. It's a manifestation of something. It's a manifestation of the power of the political elite to use the state as they wish. They have the power, and they have very little restraining, countervailing power to restrain them. But anyway, I'm now getting off at a tangent. What was the question you want me to answer about corruption?
Yes, Moeletsi, you already highlighted it within your presentation around how corruption essentially is a key hindrance to our efforts towards economic growth and development. The question that was posed related to how it impacts on external partners, in particular, engaging with South Africa and contributing towards this economic growth. So less in terms of a pointed question, but more for you to further share your reflections on how corruption, which you've already done, Moeletsi, how corruption impacts our prospects. But I think you've spoken now already about a key issue of it being a symptom or a manifestation of an underlying or systemic issue. My question then to you is, what is that systemic issue? I know the answer, but I would like to hear it from you.
Okay. I don't know if I'll give you the answer that you know. Corruption in South Africa, one of the biggest drivers, or if not the main driver of corruption in South Africa, is Black economic empowerment and affirmative action. Those are the two major drivers of corruption in this country. Now, where did Black economic empowerment come from? Black economic empowerment was not invented by the ANC. Many people think the ANC invented Black economic empowerment or even affirmative action. Well, the ANC, before the invention of Black economic empowerment, was a multiracial organization. This gets forgotten. During the struggle, why the ANC survived while the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, had so much difficulty surviving, was because the ANC used all the talents of all South Africans to mobilize the world and the population against the party. So the ANC from in the 50s and 60s and onwards was a multiracial organization. So it could not have a Black economic empowerment policy, because what would happen to the Indians? What would happen to the whites? What would happen to the Jews? What would happen to the colors? All of whom were part of the alliance against the party. So the ANC did not invent Black economy. Black economic empowerment was invented by big business in this country, in particular Sanlam. Why? To protect, to buy off elements of the ANC leadership. But at the same time, by buying off elements of this, and they bought off many, Cyril Ramaphosa being one of them, by buying off these elements of the Black leadership, they also destroyed the multiracial alliance, or shall we call it compact, so that at least there is one compact I agree with. They destroyed the multiracial compact that the ANC had become from the 1950s onward, so that the ANC became now an African organization. Now, once it became an African organization, it got hugely weakened, because the strength of South Africa lies in all South Africans working together. And so the big business was protecting itself by buying off elements of the ANC leadership, giving them shares in Metropolitan Life, giving them shares, and you know the story. And then the same people who got this, the black elite, they now translated this into the state, transferred it to the state. And ironically, the person who took black economic empowerment from the private sector to the state was none other than Cyril Ramaphosa through the so-called Ramaphosa Commission, which led to the Black Economic Empowerment Act of 2003. That's where this, now, how Black economic empowerment and affirmative action drive corruption, I think we've seen it all in the Zondo Commission, we've seen it all in these PPEs and so on and so on and so forth. But now, if I can say, the business elite, in its usual way, thinks short term. They introduced Black economic empowerment because they wanted to survive in the short term. But they didn't think about the long-term implication of Black economic empowerment, which are destroying the country and are now really threatening their own businesses themselves. Expropriation of land without compensation. Who is going to be the casualty there? The business elite are the primary, not just the farmers. Anyone who owns the factory is on the land, and that land can be expropriated. So those are the dynamics that I'm saying. So this is why I'm saying that the conflict between the business elite in South Africa and the political elite today, in a way, can't be solved by a compact. Somebody has to win this particular war.
Thank you. Somebody has to win this particular war, Mweletsi Mbeki says. Before I go back to you, Yaki, I think between Kolelwa and Mweletsi, the three key comments and questions that were posed have been responded to already. But we do have our second poll for this event, and this one speaks to politics. Mweletsi Mbeki, but also Dr. Yaki Cilia, as well as Kolelwa, have already spoken to essentially the key role that party politics, plays in this process. So our second poll today asks you, our listeners and our participants, whether or not, or rather, which political party of the four main political parties do you think will take Gauteng come the next elections? While this poll goes up, it's one question, so it'll be quicker for you to respond to. We do have two hands that are up. First, I will go to Thabiso Lehoko and then Katu N. Thabiso, you are welcome to switch on your microphone and then also your video to pose your question or make your comment.
A very good afternoon to everyone. All protocol observed. It's a question, and I hope it will be answered on the principle of sufficient consensus. Yaki spoke about professionalizing the civil service and ending cadre deployment. That Mbeki seems to disagree, or is rather pessimistic about this social compact of business and government coming together, exposing them to certain vulnerabilities. Kolelo is an advocate of a developmental state. Now, I also agree with the notion of the principle of sufficient consensus. So what needs to be done to come up with a social compact that will spur economic growth? COVID-19 has battered economies worldwide. What needs to be done? How about we bring together, yes, government, business, and civil society, and come up with what's practical? Encouraging the spirit of entrepreneurialism. Instead of trimming state-owned enterprises, I think we must inject more funds and restructure them by placing young people at the forefront and to lead them and end corruption. So my question to panelists in brief would be, what needs to be done? Thanks.
Thank you, Thabiso. Katu, you can pose your question or make your comment.
Good afternoon. I hope my microphone is not too faint.
You can hear me clearly.
Okay, perfect. Then my question is only about the recording of this webinar in particular, will it be available for playback? Because I did happen to join late. I was in another meeting, unfortunately.
Great, thank you very much. That's an easy question for me to respond to. This event is being live streamed at the moment. The video of the event will be available on the ISS Africa Facebook page, as well as the ISS Africa website. We have also partnered with News24 for this event, so you will find a recording of this very same event again through News24's media channels. So Katu, you didn't miss anything, you just came a bit late. Yaki, I'm going to turn to you. I know you had your hand raised already, but the question that Tabiso posed, which is what needs to be done, but importantly, he brings on something that we haven't spoken about until now. State-owned enterprises, but then also the role of entrepreneurship within this process. So Yaki, I'm going to turn to you to respond to any of the key issues that have been raised, but then also to address these questions around what next then. You know, we've talked about the issues, we've talked about the problems, but we need to be looking towards action. So what needs to be done? Yaki?
Thanks, Ottilia. I thought that Moeletsi made a number of very important points because what has happened is that the ANC has become a black nationalist movement and it is stepped away from its non-racial tradition. Given our past, given where South Africa comes from, it's going to take, building this kind of social compact, the kind of myth upon which we are going to build our future is a generational challenge. It is the product of education, kids going to school, and building a new myth about South Africa's past, but also our future. There is only one basis upon which you can build a prosperous South Africa, and that is a non-racial, a class-based analysis. But if we do not step away from our obsession is, I will get hammered for that, with our focus on race, it divides us because we come with different histories. And the problem is that the discussion about race is really a discussion about redistribution. It's not really a discussion about growth. And my argument is that without growth, nothing is possible. So we can build a social compact if we're all dirt poor and the country goes down, that it will help nothing. We need to grow the economy. It is the number one priority. And what needs to be done, I mean, 20,000 economists and people that know have put the priorities on the table. Social compacting by itself will contribute eventually to that, but not now. It requires leadership, it requires prioritization. So, you know, yesterday, the ANC top 6 met for 7 hours with Jacob Zuma. I mean, please, for a man who, I mean, this is our problem, is that we do not prioritize and lead. We consult one another to death. And if we embark upon the social, and this is the problem that the ANC has, it's trying to keep an increasingly divergent organization together instead of making clear choices. And that means endless consultation and discussions. And Moeletsi also made important points about the nature of black economic empowerment in South Africa. It is not about investing in the future drivers of growth, which is education and health and these kind of things. It is about instant gratification. And instant gratification, if it had been about investment in entrepreneurship, we wouldn't have a situation where 18 million South Africans today are quite necessarily on social grants. When you look at the experience of China, amongst others, but many other countries, they see poverty alleviation as an investment in growth, not a handout. And that investment in entrepreneurship and self-sustainability and innovation at community level, we don't see in South Africa. We are creating a culture of dependence. And this is very different, for example, to what you see in East Africa. So we ask what needs to be done. We need to get the fundamental, we need to firstly grow, and we need to remove all the impediments to growth, and we need to invest in the true fundamentals of growth. They are the provision of education, not only quality, but quantity of education, in health, and improving our human capital. And that over time will unlock 2, 3, 4% growth, but it'll take years. The search for a magic bullet, I think, is like the Holy Grail. We won't get there. Let's start with the fundamentals. Let's start growing the economy, and then over time, we will get to our social compact.
Thank you very much, Yaki. I see a comment here from Chandra Gold, who says that she worries that the idea that all or most young people can or should be entrepreneurs is deeply flawed and even dangerous. Being an entrepreneur, she says, requires social capital, agency, as well as confidence, and the ability to take risks and access to networks. In the absence of these key ingredients, Chandra argues, we are setting up the youth in many regards to failure, because unfortunately, this is not the reality for most young South Africans. We do have a little bit more time for additional questions and comments. I note the hand raised by Hans Buller, the regional representative for the Hans Seidel Foundation, the co-funder of this event this afternoon. With that, I'm going to hand over to you, Hans. Please go ahead and pose your question.
Thank you very much, Ottilia, and also to the brilliant speakers. It's fascinating listening to you, but also in a way frustrating, because it seems that even in this small group, it's almost impossible to find compromise and common ground. And I think maybe that's the biggest challenge when it comes to the idea of a social compact. I wonder sometimes when we talk about all those issues, I think Chandra Gold just touched on it, that semantic also matters a lot. Yeah, redistribution. I also think that when I follow Yaki's remarks, that in general, I think he does agree with redistribution to a certain point when we talk, for example, about social grants. So I think sometimes, do we ask the right questions? For example, when it comes to welfare programs, do welfare programs simply redistribute wealth and therefore hamstring the market, or do they address market failures and can make the market more productive, for example? Yeah. So maybe instead of asking what can we do for the poor, the question is, why are people poor and how can we invest in overcoming those reasons? Yeah. So these kind of raising, maybe thinking a little, it's not new. Yeah, many countries have gone through this process, but maybe asking questions in another way and bring people together to find this compromise. I think this is maybe the biggest task of the elite, be it the elite which is young or the older. Thank you very much, Ottilia.
Thank you very much, Hans. Before I go back to the panel for final thoughts and reflections, now is the time for us to see the results of the last or the second poll that you all voted in. Again, we have 76% of you that voted, which is extremely, extremely interesting. If you can all take to the polls with as much gusto as you take to ISS polls, we would greatly appreciate it. Now, the results we have here are that a coalition is likely to govern Gauteng. For those of you who do not know what Gauteng is, it is the economic hub of South Africa and the most populous province in the country. 50% of you think a coalition will govern Gauteng. 47% think that the African National Congress will govern Gauteng. Only 3% think that the Democratic Alliance on its own will govern Gauteng, and 0% say the economic freedom fighters. Yaki, you wrote a book on this particular scenario for 2024. I wonder if, and I see you now rubbing your hands because this is in line with your predictions 3 years ago, Yaki. So if anything, you may have a crystal ball. That being said, until election day, until after election day, again, we don't know until the results are out. I'm going to turn to you, panelists, for essentially what will be your closing remarks. Colleagues, as our panelists are going through their closing remarks, there will be one final poll. This one is for you to respond to whether this event was useful for you and whether you would want to see events similar to this in future, and also whether anything that was said during the course of this discussion will be useful. You've already done exceptionally well in responding to our past 2 polls. So I ask you again, begging your patience, to vote in this final poll and tell us if we are doing well, not too well, or if what we are saying is of interest to you and you would want to engage in conversations like this in the future. Yaki, turning to you first to give us some of your closing thoughts and remarks, and then after you, Mweletsi, and finally, Kolelwa, I'll turn to you.
Thanks, Ottilia. I just had to scroll down on this poll to find the relevant age group for me, so that took a bit of time. But in any case, I think the question about Gauteng, I think it's, I'd be very surprised if the ANC maintained their 50%. The question is only, will it be a growth coalition or a redistribution coalition? Will it be stable or not? Gauteng is the economic heartland of South Africa. What happens in Gauteng will determine to a large extent South Africa's future. The Western Cape was already, the ANC already will not regain power in the Western Cape, I think. So what happens in Gauteng is going to be critical for the future of South Africa. Development is about empowerment. Before this webinar, I was reading up on China's, how China eliminated extreme poverty. And we also know the story of many other countries. They did it through hard work and by identifying and empowering individual poverty-stricken communities. They did not do it through mass handouts. They did not do it through cash grants, which is important for South Africa, because cash grants have done more to uplift people and to alleviate extreme poverty than any other measure. But eventually it is not sustainable. Eventually only empowering people that they can help themselves, and government playing a very particular role in that, is the only way that we are going to change South Africa's future. You cannot build a country where you have slightly more than 6 million taxpayers, 18 million on grants. And it sounds like such a capitalist pro-business argument. It's not. It's an argument about absolutely basic fundamentals. You can just look at how capital investment in South Africa is declining to know that we are heading for severe problems. South Africans need to, I want to reiterate, we need to invest in what really are the long-term drivers of growth: health and education, medical, and all of these kind of things. Many of the other, we of course need to deal with the symptoms of poverty itself through social or a big grant, or whatever the case is. Yes, you know, I'm not for a moment arguing that those are not important. I'm just making, my argument is that leadership and unlocking economic growth is literally a prerequisite for eventually getting to that inevitable discussion about our past and where we want to go. And at the moment, it's much easier, and I think it's the only way to go, is to focus on where we want to go, to focus on those key goals in the future. Because this discussion about race and where we come from and your history and my history, we will discuss that for many years. And I think that will only resolve itself as our children come through the educational process and they come with a new mindset and bring new values to the future. So thank you very much for participation.
Thank you, Yaki. Mweletsi, over to you. Final thoughts and reflections.
Okay, my final thoughts, I have two or three final thoughts. Is that permissible? Well, my first thought is I would love to hear what Yaki think the difference is between the United States and South Africa. I outlined the common history of these two countries, but he still thinks that I'm wrong there. So, but maybe we don't have time. Maybe I'll buy him some beer or some, I think we are now allowed to drink by the dictatorship. But I would love to hear what he thinks the difference. But most importantly, I think South Africa does not have a welfare state. Many people are under the impression that social grants are a manifestation of a welfare state. Social grants are a form of keeping the poor poor and compelling them to vote for the political elite. That is the purpose of the social grants. It is nothing to do with the welfare state of Europe after the Second World War, of Scandinavia, and all those things. What emerged with the welfare state after the Second World War, the priority in the welfare state was to produce a labor force that was healthy, that was skilled, which is why the welfare state of the post-war in the Western capitalist countries was a big driver of things like the National Health Service, like the education system. If you look at, for example, British universities, probably most of British universities today were built after the Second World War by the government. So the purpose was to produce a labor force that was highly skilled and therefore very productive. The so-called welfare state of South Africa is targeting the huge poor population. We didn't have the time to show you how the social structure of South Africa. I had a diagram which I wanted to show you. But nearly 50% of the South African population is made up of what statistics SA calls the underclass and they are unemployed. But they are also 50% of the electorate. And the ANC vote, they are the anchor tenant of the ANC vote. So the so-called social grants are intended to keep these people in their poverty, but to make them feel dependent on the ANC and to keep voting for the ANC as they're doing today. That is why, and that is one of the major problems that is a hurdle, is the ANC itself to economic growth. So that's why I'm saying, and maybe one day we'll have more time to go through it. That's why I'm saying the conflict between the political elite and the business elite has to be won. It can't be hushed over, because when you hush it over, it creates stagnation in the economy. It doesn't create growth. So it has to be won by one or the other. Now, who makes up the alliance with one or the other to win this particular war, obviously is a question for leadership and all the things that the panelists have talked about. But at the end of the day, it has to be won. Then it will free South Africa from those who benefit from stagnation and from those who benefit from the poverty of the mass of the people of South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Xolelwa, over to you in terms of final thoughts and reflections.
Thank you, Otelia, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I just want to caution about being too fixated on ANC and what the ANC does, because as you can see from our poll, it seems like it will no longer be relevant. And from our own research as well, we found that we might not have that ruling party in the next few years. We predicted by 2024 they'd be ejected, but it seems like COVID has made that sooner. So in our thinking, this thing of being worried about what the ANC does with the grants, it seems to me like we're throwing out the baby with the dirty water. So I just want to caution against that, because we might see something else even after these coming local government elections. What I agree with Yaki on is this process of myth building. I think it's very important. I like that idea of myth building, but I would qualify it by saying added to that should be a set of non-negotiables. Now, that takes me back to that basic income grant. Can we agree as South Africans that no single South African can live below a particular amount of income? Without thinking about what the ANC does with the social grants, but in terms of the principle of a basic minimum grant. Now, I believe that for compacts to be useful or effective, they need to be issue specific, or they need to be of a particular or informed by a particular location. Because sometimes when you think about these grand, big compacts at a national level, it becomes more difficult to find that common vision. So if we eat this elephant bit by bit, we say maybe, for example, we look on platinum, with a platinum project in the world. And we know the potential that has in terms of energy generation, the automotive industry. Can South Africans be audacious to think of, influencing economic growth by just focusing on that, a specific mineral that is unique to us and is well located strategically to deal with our own problems, but also the problems of the world in terms of the carbon footprint. But also in agreement with Hans, all of this requires a level of compromise. Compacting cannot be an easy thing. You need to know that you have to give some things up. You can't hold on to particular strong positions, and ideology is not a good ingredient for compacting, because we can never find each other, and that is what makes us this country at war, because we differ so much ideologically and otherwise. So that's what I would leave it at, a bit of compromise, myth building, but also being issue specific or location specific. Could be a compact around Gauteng, who knows? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kolelwa from Mistra, Ms. Kolelwa Kashekatia. Thank you very much, Dr. Yaki Silia, as well as you, Moletsi Mbeki, for what I believe, if what Moletsi said is anything to go by, is simply the start of a much deeper conversation around whether or not, one, a social compact is the key to unlocking economic growth, but perhaps also a conversation on the key issues and priorities that we highlighted in this discussion today. There's a lot that can be said, so it won't be fair on me to attempt to summarize. What I will do, though, is speak to some of the key issues arising from this conversation, whether we refer to it as a social compact, a contract, an agreement, a convention, a covenant. The idea that a society needs to have, at the very least, some consensus, some meeting of minds in terms of the future of the country, but importantly, in terms of the past and the present of the country, seems to be accepted. How that is shaped, for what purpose it is shaped, and which actors are involved is still something that requires further discussion, even as we accept that. If what Yaki, together with Moletsi and Kolelwa, have highlighted this afternoon around prioritization, around leadership, around the role of the youth, women, men, business, the state, various actors employed or unemployed in building that process forward is something that we need to reflect on. Let it be so. If from the participation in this event today, people are really interested in seeking the answers to key problems bedeviling our society, then let's be part of that conversation, not only in problematizing the issues, but also in crafting the right kinds of solutions. Kolelwa reminded us that history matters, class, gender, and race matters. And Yaki said, as much as those matter, we need to be shaping a way forward towards a non-racial society that is inclusive, but that also recognizes that economic growth is the vehicle through which we'll be able to ensure that kind of society that we want to work towards. With that, to all of you who've joined us today, thank you very much for spending your time with us this afternoon. You will be spending a bit more time with us in the future. Like Moletsi said, this is a conversation that simply can't be had only in an hour and a half. If Moletsi and Yaki can have it over beer, I'm sure all of you can have these various conversations together in your separate spaces over tea, coffee, maybe even a beer if we're permitted to have them. But with that, thank you very much. Thank you to the Hansaido Foundation. Thank you to News24 for partnering with the ISS in this event. And thank you all for your particular interest in finding and shaping ways towards which we can grow South Africa together, today, and for the future. Enjoy the rest of your day.